Hello, everyone, and thanks for participating in today's Fast Facts webinar. We're going to spend about 30 minutes today talking about something very important. The webinar is called Finding the Balance, Dues and Membership. So obviously, dues and the members you have are really the most important facet of the club. They are the club. And we're going to talk today about the relationship between the number of members you have, how much it costs to be a member, and how those things can be measured and correlate to the financial health of a club. Obviously, the dues revenue of a club is the lifeblood of the club, and clubs that have inadequate dues revenue, sometimes they understand that, sometimes they don't. Those clubs are typically in some level of financial strain. Clubs that have adequate, sometimes even more dues revenue than they need, they're in an envious position, and obviously they have a bright future ahead of them. And we're going to really just talk about the relationships between those two things and hopefully present you with some interesting things that you can take back and think about relative to your own club, and maybe think about how you start bringing some of these concepts into the boardroom to align the board members around this really, really crucial issue that frankly doesn't get enough time quite often. Quite often, we spend time with many, many clubs, and we see lots of time being spent, as you all know, on things like food and beverage and banquets, but really an inadequate amount of time being focused on what is the core driver of the club, and that being the dues revenue. We use the analogy of a dues engine for clubs, and it's very simple. Just think of it as a two-cylinder engine, and in one cylinder you have the number of members, and in the other cylinder you have how much it costs to be a member at the club. Ultimately, what every club should very specifically understand, and it changes over time, obviously, as amenities at the club might change or as costs might change, but ultimately every club should understand what's the dues revenue that this club needs to fund itself operationally. That dues revenue, as we'll see, ultimately floats down through a gross profit calculation we're going to take a look at, and ultimately funds the fixed expenses of the club. So understanding what the level of dues revenue your club needs, what's the right optimization between the number of members and how much each member pays, all that is a very strategic discussion. For clubs to really understand what's the optimum balance for how many members do we want in this club and how much should each member pay, that's not a tactical discussion. That's a strategic discussion that frankly should have a period of 5 or 10 years out as you think about the future of the club and how the things that the club needs to do going forward is going to be funded. So it's really a critical notion, and we like the analogy of a dues engine just because it's pretty simple to sort of grasp that concept of you've got these two cylinders, and really ultimately for your club those things need to be in balance with each other. How do we measure dues? Do we just look at it as an absolute number? You can look at dues as a revenue number. Obviously, it is a revenue number. Ultimately, one of the key gauges we use in sizing whether a club produces enough dues revenue or not is simply what we call the dues ratio. It's one of the simplest ratios we look at. Folks that have been with us or have heard us speak a number of times know that we very rarely benchmark or compare or use absolute numbers in what we do. And we use lots and lots of ratios and proportions in what we do, because when you use ratios, it keeps things in perspective. It lets you size one number relative to another number, and that helps put things in context and perspective. And the dues ratio is very much like that. So dues ratio is very simply your total dues revenue divided by the operating revenue of the club. Now, note I said operating revenue. That is that's specifically meaning operating revenue and not including capital revenue, which would be things like capital dues or initiation fees. And so it's a really easy indicator. Most controllers or GMs could probably do that number right in their head. But what we find is across the industry, the dues ratio for the industry right at the median is right at about 50%. So what does that mean? That means 50 cents of every operating revenue dollar that flows into the club is actually dues revenue, and it's a really easy indicator to remember. Obviously, the clubs that have a higher than typical dues ratio are going to have some capabilities that clubs that have a lower than typical dues ratio aren't going to have. So why is the dues ratio critical? Well, as we'll see in a minute, the dues ratio has a direct correlation through what we'll look at in a minute called gross margin, a direct correlation to the operating bottom line of the club. And those clubs that have a higher than typical dues ratio, we'll see, have a higher than typical gross margin and they have a higher than typical operating result. Clubs that have a low dues ratio have a lower gross margin and a lower than typical operating result. And so there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. Generally, the clubs in the middle here tend to break even, and the clubs on the right side tend to throw off cash. The clubs on the left side tend to consume cash or have an operating deficit, I should say. But the first and most important thing is to understand where you are, right? You can't possibly have the discussion in the boardroom or finance committee about too high, too low, we need more, we have too much, dues is too high, dues is too low. You can't have that discussion if you don't know where you are. So by knowing that, hey, we have a 40% dues ratio, we have a 53% dues ratio, knowing where you are is the first place in the discussion. So that's critical. As I mentioned, clubs that have a typical dues ratio, right around 50%, have a typical gross margin, right around 60%. Now, why is gross margin important? Well, gross margin obviously is an indicator of the size of the gross profit of the club, or again of that liquidity of the revenue of the club that can be used to fund the fixed expenses. Fixed expenses are things like G&A, buildings, operations and maintenance, course maintenance, etc. Folks that have heard us talk about that, the sources and uses of gross profit can probably picture the pie chart in their head that we talk about a lot. But clearly there's a correlation between the gross margin of the club and the dues ratio of the club. So clubs that are down in this lower region of dues ratio, they have lower gross margins. Clubs that are in the upper region of dues ratio have higher gross margins, and we'll see in a minute specifically how that might correlate to the operating result of the club. Interestingly, when you think about now the balance, the two cylinders, right? What are the attributes of the two cylinders for clubs that tend to be in the middle of this ratio, clubs that tend to be on the upper end and lower end of this ratio? So clubs on the lower end, meaning your dues ratio is low, right? So here, the folks in this quartile have 42 cents or less of every operating dollar come from dues. Clubs up here have 55 cents or more of every dollar come from membership dues. And so what we see is these clubs, typically have a member count of about 377. We use full member equivalents, and they're paying about $6,400 a year in dues. Now, what's interesting is when you compare the clubs in the lower dues ratio quartile to the clubs, let's say, right in the middle of the industry, the dues that a member pays is almost exactly the same. So moving from this quartile over into these quartiles is not really about these clubs charging more per member for dues. It's really fundamentally these clubs have more members. So, not surprisingly, the clubs down in this zone, they're quite often the clubs that over the last few years have lost members, haven't been able to replace them, and thus as their member count has, through attrition, dwindled down, their dues revenue has dwindled down, and thus the dues ratio has dwindled down. But it's interesting to note that really the difference between these two quartiles is about the member count. Also interestingly, when you compare this middle of the industry to the upper quartile, folks that have really strong dues ratios or dues engines, it's not that they necessarily have more members, it's they're actually getting more dues revenue per member. So these are clubs that either have maybe they're a status club, maybe they just have an amenity set which is over the top. There's something about these clubs that's got a clear and present value proposition that allows them to charge more per member. So it's just interesting to note that in one case it's about member count, and then moving to the other quartile, it's more about how much each member pays. Now, when we look at the different types of clubs, in fact, while we spend a lot of time in the industry talking about the consistency of the financial model of clubs, obviously across a range of things, there are differences between clubs with golf, clubs without golf, yacht clubs, etc. And in this case, it's no different and probably not surprising. What we see is clubs with golf, that dues ratio is right at 50% at the median. City athletic clubs are right around 40%, and yacht clubs are basically there, high 30s to 40%. So, certainly if you're a golf club, you would want to use a benchmark that was more correlated to golf clubs, and if you're not, you want to use the benchmark that's more correlated to the type of club that you are. But it is important to note there is variation, and again, not surprising if you think about a city club. More of their revenue comes from food and beverage, and meaning less per dollar comes from dues. Thus, they would have a lower dues ratio in those types of clubs. But there's another perspective that I think conveys why it is that dues is so important, and especially important to bring to the board, so that when they start talking about food and beverage, you can kind of back them down a little bit and say, you know what, maybe we should really spending more time talking about our dues engine and dues, because gross profit, typically if board folks have their own businesses or executives in businesses, they're very familiar with the notion of gross profit and gross margin and why it's fundamentally critical to every single business. And in fact, clubs are no different. So it's pretty easy for them to grasp in this sort of education process when you show them these charts that come out of the system, or just you present through these type of webinars or white papers that we do. It's very easy to see that the vast majority of gross profit actually comes from dues. So by having a weak dues engine, it's not hard to understand that our gross profit is going to suffer as well. So when you see that, in the golf world, about 80% almost of gross profit comes from dues, about the same in the yacht world, and a little bit lower in the city athletic club world. But clearly, it conveys the notion, the teaching moment here is that the club is funded primarily by dues. Couple other things, golf operations or sports and recreation, that we won't get into now. But for by and large, it really is a dues story when it comes to understanding the gross profit of a club, and hence going back to that balance between member count and what each member pays. So then we take the next step. So we're sort of stepping through the notion of the dues engine, the dues ratio that feeds clearly the gross margin of a club. And then together, the dues ratio and the gross margin really are extremely strong indicators of the net operating result of the club. So if we look in the middle of the industry, which fundamentally is at roughly a break-even point operationally, right? They don't consume cash operationally. They don't throw off any cash operationally. They just break even, which is a fine place to be. We see those typical gross margins of 60% and 50%. And we know, that when we see clubs that have lower than typical gross margins and dues ratios, those are the clubs that tend to burn cash. When we see clubs that have higher than typical gross margins and dues ratios, those are the clubs that have a surplus of cash operationally. So when you're looking at things like budgeting, or getting into now what we start talking about predictive management, right? We use these indicators as predictors of the forward year, not just looking back at how we did last year. We were only able to get there by spending 5 years analyzing the industry and looking at past results. But now we can take that and actually project forward. So if I didn't see the actual operating result of a particular club, but I knew it had a low gross margin and a low dues ratio, I have a pretty good guess that club is going to lose money, burn money operationally. And obviously the contrary, if I see relatively high gross margins and dues ratios, I'm pretty darn sure that club is going to have an operational surplus. So when you're going through your budget processes, understanding, where these key ratios are and using validated benchmarks to compare against, really can put forward-looking view into the operating results that you're going to achieve, not sort of waiting to the end of the year and see, how do we make our numbers. So it's critical to understand the relationship between that dues engine and ultimately the net operating result of the club. So now if we talk a little bit more specifically about the balance between those two cylinders, it's very interesting. I mean, we've studied hundreds and hundreds of clubs over the last couple years, from via data from well over 1,000 clubs, and while clubs don't always fall in these end condition buckets, I'm going to give you a couple examples because I think they're interesting to sort of understand and grasp. We will see quite often clubs that fall into two different types of categories, and these are clubs that have a lower than typical member count and a higher than typical, for a club of a particular size meaning revenue, and a higher than typical cost to be a member at that club, or higher than typical dues. So lower than typical number of members, higher than typical dues. usually that's an indication, not always, but usually an indication that they've had membership attrition that they haven't been able to backfill. And what they're really trying to do is balance the books, or in effect, generate an appropriate dues ratio on fewer and fewer members. And obviously you can get away with that a little bit, but eventually that well runs dry. You can only go back to the same members, especially if it's still dwindling, so often for so much money. There is only so much money that a particular club is, worth being a member in. And those clubs, we would say, have a typically low member count, relatively high dues, and quite often we see those clubs having an operational deficit because they just can't quite get there with the number of members, even though they're hitting those members pretty hard. So this represents operating results. So we'll often see those conditions. On the flip side of that, what we will also see is, for a club of a particular size, a higher than typical member count and actually a lower than typical dues. So you have more members paying less than one might expect to pay to be a member at a club like that, and in fact an operating result which is quite a bit on the positive side. And that's a club that generally we would say has a very visible and present value proposition, right? It's active, there's lots of people in there, drinking, eating, playing golf, tournaments, and they're the clubs that, the members really want their friends to join because it's a great deal and it's a lot of fun, and there's a great culture in the club, which frankly is supported by a well-balanced dues engine. So, one of those clubs has a struggling value proposition. One of those clubs has a very clear and present value proposition. Of course, there's lots of clubs that fit in the middle, but it is interesting to note, if you're moving one way or the other relative to that I'll call it balance of member count and how much you're charging each member, it's wise to think about, what is this saying about our future value proposition if we don't get ahead of this? That's where the balance, that strategic discussion around balance, becomes critically important. So this part of the thing is of the webinar is not an exact science, but I think this chart again conveys those notions of the relationships between dues, member counts, operating results, and ultimately what does that say about the value proposition of the club. And so clubs that have typical member counts, typical dues, and a break-even operating result, you kind of call that's sort of the middle of the industry. That's a balanced value proposition. Clubs that have high member count, it's relatively low cost to be a member there. And there are some household name clubs. It's amazing that you would be surprised at how cheap it is to be a member, but they have lots and lots of members. And it's a high value proposition. It's a positive operating result. And those are great, healthy clubs. Obviously, we talked about the flip side of that. And then there is another variation, which is, a lower than typical number of members. There is a higher than typical dues, but they're throwing off an operating surplus still. And quite often, those are what we would call the exclusive clubs. They're the clubs that, they really only want 225 or 250 members, and the value proposition to them is exclusivity. Quite often, those are just really nice small golf clubs, and they're willing to open up their checkbooks to have that exclusivity. So that's still a balanced engine for that club. It's just they have a different value proposition they're offering to their membership. It is important, especially when dealing with the boardroom discussion, there really is no substitute for dues revenue. The one that seems to come up all the time is, we're struggling, we need more cash, it's really hard to get members. Maybe we should raise the food and beverage minimum. Maybe we should go out and try to get 10 more banquets next year. Obviously, we all know what the margin is like on food and beverage. On a la carte, there's at least 3/4 of the clubs in the country, the data says, loses money in food and beverage overall. A la carte has the lowest of margins in food and beverage, and while banquets have a little bit higher margin than a la carte food and beverage does, we're still talking about pennies on the dollar. So if your issue is not enough dues revenue, there's no way you're going to generate a significant amount of substitute dues revenue via F&B. There's not enough hamburgers in the world you can cook that'll get you to that point. And then of course, the other thing that actually happens in real life is when you have a operating deficit and you have to patch that up because you have to pay the bills somehow. what really happens is you end up stealing your capital income. It's clearly not a good substitute for dues revenue or a good substitute for an operational deficit, but it is what happens. And that often, if it's not gotten in check very, very quickly, that can be the start of a spiraling process where, the longer you go on and the more capital you steal, obviously the less you're able to reinvest back in the club. The club starts to look a little bit shabby, which makes it harder to get new members, or maybe even you lose members more quickly because the place isn't looking so great, and you get down that circular spiral, which is very hard to pull out of, especially if you don't really understand what's going on. So, you can't replace dues revenue with other things. It really is a dues business, as we all know, and we're just trying to focus on the measures here. So it's critical to not try to replace it with something that's really not appropriate to try to take the place of dues revenue. Where obviously this is a little bit of a setup question, but I like to ask because it's something that clubs face all the time, and these little exercises they go through all the time. I ask, what is the most dangerous question that clubs ask each other every day? And given the topic, it's probably not a surprise that what I'm talking about is when, typically driven from a board meeting, they'll say, hey, go off and ask the 20 clubs around here what they charge for dues. Now, that might have a little bit of marketing value. Maybe you find out if it is a competitive environment, maybe you find out what others are charging. I mean, obviously you never want to price your club, with cost being the lowest common denominator, right? You want to have a good value proposition, not just join us because we're the cheapest club. But it's very, very dangerous because hopefully you'll now can capture from the discussion we've had that it really is about the dues engine. You have to understand what is the dues revenue that this club requires in order to have the gross margin it needs and fund all of its fixed expenses and have that operating break even or better result. So when you ask the clubs down the road, what are your dues, you're getting not even half the right answer because you don't know how many members they have. You have a certain number of members. You might have 500 members. They might have 700 members. You charge, 6,000 in dues. They charge, or 7,000 in dues. They charge 5,000 in dues. So when you just present somebody with a spreadsheet of, we charge 7,000, they're 5,000, someone else is 9,000, they're 6,500. It doesn't tell you anything. What you really need to understand is how much dues revenue does our club need to support itself? And that's the focus because that's how it starts. How much dues revenue do we need? And now what's the calculus we make? What's the balance we create between how much each member pays and how many members we have? But ultimately, what you really need to determine is how much dues revenue do you need? And obviously the dues ratio is a really easy and very correlated way to do that, right? By at least targeting that sort of 50% number in the middle of the industry. So, really try to avoid that exercise of going down and gathering up a spreadsheet full of here's what other clubs down the street pay, because what the club 5 miles away requires for dues revenue has nothing to do with what you require for dues revenue. And your member count's different than their member count. So it really is a very, very dangerous proposition to go through those exercises. And I know everybody's been through them, and I'm sure it's not going to stop overnight. But if you can short circuit that and really get the board to think about, let's talk about dues revenue as opposed to talking about dues, it really can change the discussion in a very meaningful way. So, to beat this analogy bloody in terms of engine maintenance, dues engine maintenance, there are some yellow and red flags. We hear these all the time, and anyone that's been in the industry for a fair amount of time has heard these things too, right? We haven't raised dues in 5 years. Uh-oh, that's a problem, and that's a case where probably someone is burning cash operationally, stealing their capital, because if you look at what's happened to costs in 5 years, it's not easy to say that there's no way the level of dues revenue you had 5 years ago is going to make up for what you had now, or the level of dues per member even. The board can't agree to raise dues. You've got I've heard this. Well, we don't raise dues. We just have an operating assessment every year. Well, I mean, that is the definition of a shell game. I mean, you can call it something else, but what you're really doing is you're charging dues, but in a different way. And I think there's a dangerous cultural, perspective on that, which is when you do it as an assessment, you're kind of conveying to the membership, we missed something. Something happened that we didn't expect. And so it's important to train the membership to focus on, no. As members, you have to fund this club, and this is what it requires to fund this club. We've heard, hey, finding new members is really hard, so we'll just, let's focus on banquets for the next year. We talked about that. Obviously, that's a red flag in a big way. The not on my watch president, who campaigned on, I promise there will not be a dues increase, because that, fundamentally what that person is saying is, I don't understand the financial model of the club, which I'm about to take over as president, right? So that's a serious red flag, because there are lots of follow-on effects by that person really having very little understanding of what funds the club and what drives the club. Now, you can use all the information we talk about, obviously, as a way to educate, right? What we do isn't tell people what the answer is. We give them information so that they can both educate and have the right discussions to move the discussion and the decisions in the right direction. We're full, but we're still short on cash. That's usually happens when, in concert with us, we haven't raised dues in 5 years, right? So they're full, membership is full, but they've had this anti-dues increase mentality, and ultimately you can't keep up that way, and you just fall farther and farther behind. And remember, that dollar of dues revenue that you should have increased last year and collected last year, that dollar is never coming back, right? You might be able to increase dues for the coming year, but that dollar that you lost the previous year because dues wasn't increased, that dollar is gone forever, and that has a snowplow effect. So, what are the things that should be considered, should be thought about in this notion of dues engine maintenance? Clearly understand your key ratios, understand how those correlate to the financial model of a club, keeping it all in context, and how that dues engine drives right down through directly to the bottom operating line of the club. Understand how much dues revenue your club needs. Don't focus on what other clubs charge for dues, because you don't know what their dues revenue needs are. You need to focus on yours, and then come up with that strategic optimal member count, and then laser focus on that as hard as you can. To the extent that you can, train over time. This isn't an event, it's a process, but train the membership to expect an increase in dues every year, and get away from this notion of, we're having a dues increase. What happened? What went wrong? Nothing went wrong, right? Costs go up year after year in their homes. Cable bills go up every year. Cell phone bills go up every year. It's the same thing in clubs. So the more you can train them to expect the dues increase, and maybe have a discussion around, is it 0.5% or 2.5%? Okay, that's at least better than, are we having one or not? Obviously, clearly don't treat capital income as dues revenue. That's a very bad thing. Same thing. Don't rely on food and beverage as a replacement for dues revenue. That doesn't work. And the longer you go without maintaining your dues engine, frankly, the more likely you are for a major rebuild down the road. We've had clubs where they have spent several years without a dues increase, and then really get in trouble and have to come up with a 20 or in some cases 30% dues increase in 1 year. So that's a very challenging scenario to go through, and can really be avoided by just doing these little incremental raises every year. It really has a tremendous impact on the club, and by having that operational break even, which is supported by a good dues ratio, really then lets you not steal your capital and use your capital for what it should be used for, which is reinvesting back in the club. So all these moving parts ultimately come together in that we're supported operationally, and we're generating the capital income so that we can reinvest back in the facilities, which will continue to drive in those prospective members on an ongoing basis. So I appreciate everyone's time today. I hope it was beneficial information. There'll be certainly other sessions coming up. And if you're not a Club Benchmarking subscriber currently, but you might have interest, feel free to contact us, and we're happy to show you how it all works and how clubs use it. But with that, thanks for joining us today, and we'll talk to you soon.